Good afternoon, professors, invited guests, and cohort 4 classmates. I'm Kevin Maloney, and along with Zahid Williams and Chris Morello, will present our capstone highlighting our research into the 2019 New York State criminal justice reforms. Collectively, we're executives in the NYPD with over 73 years of law enforcement experience and have served as commanding officers of 7 different precinct, housing, and transit commands throughout New York City. At any given time over the last 30 years, at least one of us has been working in an operational crime-fighting capacity and have developed extensive working knowledge of the criminal justice system, including how the use of pretrial detention and cash bail were effective tools in reducing crime. The premise to our capstone was to examine the research question, what impact did the 2019 criminal justice reforms have on public safety, namely burglaries and shooting incidents within New York City? Specifically, we analyzed both quantitative and qualitative data that will be discussed later in this presentation to determine if these reforms had a statistically significant impact on these crime rates. The criminal justice reforms were passed in April of 2019 as part of the New York State annual budget. The legislation was championed by advocates as a fix to a system that many felt was discriminatory in nature and placed an unfair burden on poor and minority communities. It was estimated in some cases that as much as 60% of the jail population consisted of offenders who had not been convicted of a crime, but rather were subjected to bail conditions that they were unable to beat, resulting in their continued incarceration as they awaited trial. One egregious example highlighted in our research was the case of Khalif Browder. At the age of 16, Mr. Browder was arrested and indicted for robbery. He was unable to make bail as he continued to maintain his innocence. For over 3 years, he remained incarcerated, unable to post bail, as his case navigated its way through a backlog court system. During his time in jail, Khalif spent significant time in solitary confinement after altercations with guards and other inmates. Over time, he became depressed, suicidal, and made several attempts to take his own life. Khalif was never convicted and eventually released from Rikers after his accuser left the United States and the charges were dismissed. However, the scars from his pretrial detention remained until he died by suicide at his home at the age of 22. Few would argue that reforms to the system were appropriate and long overdue, but questions have been raised asking if the legislator did their due diligence prior to passing these criminal justice reforms and whether or not they solicited appropriate input from relevant stakeholders, such as law enforcement agencies and district attorneys around the state. One area that received much debate, but ultimately was not included in the legislation, was a public safety provision that would have allowed judges in New York to consider the dangerousness of an offender in their decision to impose bail. This judicial discretion exists in all other 49 states, as well as on the federal level. However, in New York, judges remain unable to consider the potential impact of public safety when deciding to set bail. Opponents of this provision objected over the potential for judicial bias in bail decisions. One possible solution that was also not included in New York reforms was the implementation of a statewide risk assessment system. These systems assign a score to an offender based on multiple factors, such as the time the crime was committed, the age of the offender at the time of offense, as well as the criminal history of the offender, including his or her appearance history on prior court proceedings. The score is then used to assist the judge in determining whether or not bail should be imposed. These systems have been implemented in other parts of the United States, including New Jersey, when that state implemented criminal justice reforms in 2017. These assessment systems have been credited with assisting in implementing a more equitable bail system without sacrificing public safety. An appropriately implemented system can not only reduce unnecessary detention, but also help reduce judicial bias and help ensure the safety of the public by keeping dangerous offenders incarcerated as they await trial. 3 significant changes were, however, enacted as part of the New York State criminal justice reforms. First was the adjustment to discovery laws, which greatly expanded the amount of evidence that must be turned over to the defense and significantly reduced the amount of time prosecutors have to turn that evidence over. This change has increased the burden on district attorney offices to comply with these deadlines, having a potential negative impact on criminal prosecutions. The second change relates to the elimination of cash bail in most nonviolent criminal cases. These reforms continue to permit cash bail in a small number of offenses, while mandating the release of offenders arrested for misdemeanors and some felonies, initially including burglary. As I mentioned, the risk to public safety is not a factor in setting bail in New York. The offender's flight risk of not returning to court and their ability to pay remain the only factors that can be considered by a New York judge in bail determinations. The third change concerned the issuance of desk appearance tickets. These reforms mandated that subjects arrested for an expanded number of offenses must now be issued desk appearance tickets and released without having to appear in front of a judge. The provision eliminated the discretion of law enforcement to decide when to process arrests live and bring offenders to court for arraignment. It also expanded the type of identification that must be accepted for an offender to qualify for a pre-arraignment release. This change related to more offenders being released after their arrests, regardless of their criminal history, without an opportunity for judicial oversight. Since the changes were implemented, there have been several high-profile incidents when an offender has been arrested multiple times post-bail reform prior to a new incident. In the prior arrest, the subject was issued a desk appearance ticket under the new rules, and the court never had an opportunity to review the appropriateness of their release. Shortly after the criminal justice reforms were enacted, crime in New York City began to increase following decades of continued crime reductions. In February of 2020, New York City Police Commissioner Dermot Shea was one of the first to identify bail reform as a contributing factor. Bill de Blasio, the self-described progressive mayor of New York, also called on lawmakers to change the law. On April 3rd, 2020, New York State Governor Cuomo did approve several modifications to the newly enacted laws and added 15 additional offenses eligible for bail, including burglaries when an offender entered the living area of a dwelling, while the laws pertaining to discovery and the issuance of desk appearance tickets remained unchanged. By the end of 2020, homicides in New York City had increased over 44%, from 319 to 462. There were over 4,500 more burglaries in New York City last year compared to 2019, and shooting incidents nearly doubled from 777 in 2019 to 1,531 last year. Our research attempted to analyze the effects of the criminal justice reforms enacted in 2020 had on this increase. The rise of crime aside, 2020 was anything but a typical year. The nationwide protests that occurred following the death of George Floyd in May, combined with the worldwide COVID pandemic, complicated any analysis of data. Our research did attempt to control for these two variables by reviewing crime data in other cities that were also affected by protests and COVID, but these cities did not make significant changes to their criminal justice programs that year. Two of these cities, Newark, New Jersey, located in close proximity to New York City, and Los Angeles, California, a metropolitan city with another large police department, both saw a rise in their homicide rates last year, although both percentages increase were lower than New York City. Neither city, however, had a similar experience when it came to burglary, a crime significantly impacted by New York State criminal justice reforms. While burglaries in Newark and Los Angeles declined in 2020, despite protests and COVID, burglaries in New York City rose a staggering 41.7%. Zahid Williams will now discuss the methods we used in our analysis of these reforms.
Well, thank you, Chief, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zahid Williams. I'm a captain here in the NYPD, and I'm going to go over the methods portion of our study. So to start off, we have the headline of we used a mixed method study, and we very intentionally started with a qualitative effort in an effort to better understand the impact of the issue and to kind of drive our quantitative analysis. So who did we speak to? We spoke with three groups. Firstly, we spoke with a group of 6 NYPD executives. We had a focus group with them. This group represented enforcement commands, oversight commands, policy commands, really a good smattering of the police department. We also spoke with several uniformed supervisors from the Criminal Justice Bureau. This bureau, it's a unit of the NYPD, and they are charged with a number of tasks. Most importantly, they liaise directly with the courts. This group was particularly important to us because what they saw was they had access to arrestees going through the system, as we call it, that is to say people that were not released on a DAT. They also had access to those arrestees' respective arresting officers and how those officers were perceiving these changes. Lastly, we spoke with a proper legal scholar, Steve Wasserman. He is a defense attorney for the Legal Aid Society. He has spent 30 years in this capacity and by every measure qualifies as someone, not only a scholar in the field, but also very, very familiar with the New York City Police Department and crime in New York City altogether. What did we see here? When we look at the qualitative portion of our study altogether, we saw very consistent themes. These themes across all three groups, despite how different they were. One, the widespread use of bail, simply inconsistent with American values. The idea that you can't go home unless you pay money prior to your case being adjudicated just didn't sit right with folks. We also saw arrestees being emboldened by these reforms. Lastly, we saw judges either unable or unwilling to use their discretion. I'll go to the group of the focus group of our NYPD executives. When we talk about arrestees being emboldened, they told us arrestees simply have no reason to cooperate with the police without the risk of being held in preventive detention. Anecdotally, they told us stories of recidivism increasing. They also told us about the difficulties they had with debriefings. Debriefings being really the lifeblood of the precision policing model, and an inability to get anything from the average prisoner because we had lost leverage on them now. If they were going to go home as a result of these new laws, there's nothing we can do to prevent that. And there was no bone that we could offer them to say, hey, maybe if you cooperate with us, we can help you out. When we talked to our supervisors down in the CJB unit, some interesting takeaways there. They spoke about the lack of consequences for repeat offenders and the demoralizing effect that this had on their respective police officers. They told us stories of several officers at some point in processing stating, quote, why even bother? I think there's one quote rather from the lieutenant that we spoke to that really, it was a thread that we saw straight across all of these interviews. If the system was broken, these reforms only broke it further. Moving to our legal scholar, he had very similar criticisms, but most notable for him was the difference in behavior amongst judges. He noticed the, quote, culture change in the court. Judges today are just far less worried about releasing a suspect who may present a threat to the public safety rather than remanding a suspect that may not. Now, historically, this is just turned on its head. Judges historically were risk averse when it came to releasing suspects. There's always this inherent fear of someone that they had released in the absence of imposing a steep bail amount, then going out and committing a subsequent violent crime maybe a day, 2 weeks later. That has completely turned around. And we took all of this, and what we decided to do as a result when it came to our quantitative data collection was we wanted to focus specifically on the post-arrest behavior of arrestees. What does that mean? We looked at the points where arrestees had a decision point post-arrest. These are arraignment actions and recidivism. Did they get arrested or not? Did they get rearrested, I should say. So how did we do this? We looked at NYPD records management systems, and we point this out because there were a lot of other players in this ecosystem that we were interested in. Think of OCA, think of maybe DCJS, think of maybe our DA partners. What we know from history and dealing with these partners, and my own experience, I'm currently assigned to the IT bureau within the NYPD. Their data just isn't as clean as we needed it to be. We do know the veracity of NYPD records management systems, both the structured input and the structured outputs. And so we chose to go with that. What did we look at specifically? We looked at burglary and we looked at gun possession. We do know that in 2020, we saw huge increases year over year in both of these crimes, shootings and burglaries. So we chose these two crimes and we broke them up into two cohorts. When we were looking at gun arrests, specifically, we were looking at gun possession arrests. I'll point out that we took all possession arrests falling under Penal Law 265, and we intentionally eliminated 265.01 because we wanted to eliminate any deadly weapons that were not a gun. When we looked at burglaries, we looked at burglars. We looked at the charge of burglary and possession of burglars' tools. We didn't want any precursors in there. A very classic one would be the charge of criminal trespass. We wanted to eliminate that because we wanted as clean of a sample as possible. So that sample across both of those years gave us our study group. And our study group fell in the first 6 months of 2019 and the first 6 months of 2020. We looked at arrests for these charges over that period, and we looked at the arraignment activities and the rearrests of those people for the following 6 months. So a simple example, if somebody's arrested June 30th of 2019, their at-risk period that we're concerned with here is following through the 180 days through December 30th, 2019. And what we did was we, of course, looked at the arraignment activities which speak for themselves, but we were also interested in recidivism, and we measured that through rearrests. We measured it through a survival analysis over time, and we performed some hazards modeling to control for relevant variables. So some of our initial findings, when we're looking at recidivism, specifically for burglary, which has a much larger sample size than our gun perpetrators, what we have here is a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis, and I'll draw your attention to the x-axis here, the lower portion of the graph. You can see we go from 0 to 180 days. That is the period at which each group is at risk. And the line that you're seeing here is a line that starts with 100% of the group that was rearrested each year. And really the takeaway from this graph is that the 2020 cohort is the black line, and the 2019 cohort is the tan or brown line. At any point in the line, with no exception, you can see that the 2020 group gets rearrested faster than the 2019 group. And an example here would be if you look at the 50-day mark, which I'm highlighting at the moment, you'll see that only 40% of the 2020 group has not been rearrested, which is to say 60% of it has been rearrested. You look at that same day for the 2019 group, it's substantially lower than that. Almost 50% of the group still exists. And when we look at our further quantitative findings for recidivism related to burglary arrests, we see more of this, frankly. So I'll draw your attention to the table in the top left. Simple enough, it's just a rearrest by cohort. So this is comparing 2019 to 2020. You can see that year over year, the proportion of the total population that was rearrested increased by 3.3%. That may not sound like a huge number, but we are talking about 257 more burglaries that were committed. That's 257 more homes that had been violated by somebody in your living space. That's 257 more commercial spaces that had been ransacked through one of the worst downturns in U.S. history. When we look at it, another quick headline number here on the table on the bottom left, you're going to see the average days to rearrest. So this tells us very simply that year over year, the 2020 group was rearrested 7.9 days faster. The average number of days was 7.9 days faster. But this conversation really isn't complete unless we control for relevant variables. So we're looking at burglaries here. And, we know through anecdote and some degree of statistical correlation that burglary is a crime of compulsion driven by a narcotics use history by the perpetrators. So we went with this Cox proportional hazards model to look at this. And the variables we chose, narcotics history, of course, we also chose age, we also chose gang affiliation and gender. When you compare Model 1 versus Model 2, which is highlighted here, you'll see that there is a negligible and a statistically insignificant difference when we compare the 2020 group with or without these control variables. So the number in the top right there, the 0.24%, is a very telling number to us because what we see, it's shown in logarithmic form here, but when you exponentiate it out, the key takeaway is at any point over the course of that at-risk period, the 2020 group was 27% more likely to be rearrested during that period when compared to the 2019 group. These results very much emblematic of what we saw in our analysis of burglary arrests and gun arrests, and is further supported by analysis of arraignment activities. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris Morello right now. He's going to go into that. He's also going to take a deep dive into our conclusions and findings.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Inspector Chris Morello, and I'll be presenting our findings and conclusions, as well as the limitations of the study and our policy recommendations. Based on our research, we've determined that the criminal justice reforms that took effect on January 1st of 2020 have directly contributed to the 42% increase in burglary that New York City experienced in 2020. Before I expand upon our findings, I should explain why we use the term directly contributed. We know that, of course, there are many causal factors with regard to crime increases. Crime spikes can be caused by economic factors, where an individual just needs money. They can be caused by social factors, such as individuals who are angry with the government or who are mentally ill. Or a career criminal can be released from jail and go on a crime spree. And very often, all of these factors have some effect on crime. We just heard an excellent presentation involving depolicing as a possible causal factor for shooting increases. So there is, of course, not just one cause of crime, but it is our opinion that the research shows that these reforms were a causal factor that directly contributed to the increase in burglary, and I will expand upon that in a minute. Our research did not prove that these reforms directly contributed to the increase in shootings. However, the research did reveal some links between the reforms and shootings, which we'll discuss. So our findings are, these statements that I just made are based on our findings specifically. Shooting victims increased by 102% in 2020, with an additional 945 people shot compared to the previous year. And burglary, of course, as we said, increased by 42%. That's an additional 4,500 burglaries compared to the previous year. However, as previously discussed by Kevin Maloney, criminal justice reforms were not the only factors to consider. COVID-19 lockdowns and the protests from the death of George Floyd made 2020 an atypical year from a policing standpoint. So we needed to look at how these two factors affected crime around the country and compare that to New York City. Kevin mentioned LA and Newark. We also looked at a study that looked at 15 major cities around the United States. And what we saw was that in those 15 major cities, gun violence increased by 7.9% when compared to New York City's 102% shooting increase. And these major cities saw burglary decrease or in some cases increase slightly, while New York City's burglary rate went up by 42%. These statistics indicate that civil demonstrations and the COVID-related shutdowns and incidents such as wearing masks, factors such as wearing masks, were not the driving force behind the crime increase experienced in New York City. As he previously discussed, law enforcement professionals whom we interviewed agreed that the reforms have led to a significant reduction in pretrial detention. In the case of burglary recidivists, experts believe that this reduction in pretrial detention contributed to these suspects being more likely to reoffend. These experts also noted the lack of leverage when questioning suspects because these suspects knew they'd be released quickly. And experts from the Criminal Justice Bureau noted changes to discovery laws have increased the burden on prosecutors to quickly prepare for trial, subsequently leading to an increase in decline to prosecute cases. Collectively, they felt these factors contributed to the increase in burglary. So the question becomes, did our research support the opinions of the experts whom we interviewed? And we found that it did. And I believe this next slide will show some statistics that prove that. All of the stats on this slide show a reduction in pretrial detention, which is, of course, time spent in jail immediately after an arrest, but before trial. And the stats show an increase in burglars being immediately released from custody following their arrests, after the criminal justice reforms took place, of course. Take a quick look at this chart, which shows in one column 2019 burg arrests, followed by 2020 burg arrests, and some key differences that our research revealed. Let's look at bail set. In 2020, there was a 40% reduction in the use of cash bail for burglary arrestees. This resulted in 686 fewer instances of a defendant having to either pay bail or be held in jail waiting for his trial. It's clear that this decrease in the use of cash bail for burglary resulted in many more arrestees being immediately released. We'll take a look at decline to prosecutes, DP, on the chart. In 2020, prosecutors declined to prosecute burglars 67% more than in 2019. This resulted in 221 more cases where defendants avoided charges completely when compared to the previous year. It seems unlikely that 67% more cases were weak in 2020 compared to the previous year. The stat shows that it is likely that solid cases are being dismissed due to the difficulties encountered by prosecutors from the changes in discovery laws. We look at ROR, released on recognizance. In 2020, burglars were ROR'd 57% more than in 2019, directly resulting in 1,225 more perpetrators who were arrested for burglary being immediately released compared to the previous year. Pled guilty at arraignment. In 2020, burglars pled guilty at arraignment 81% less than in 2019. This stat shows that after reform, suspects' attorneys were far less likely to take a guilty plea. In 2020, burglars who were arrested more than once for burglary increased by 56% when compared to 2019. This clearly shows a stark increase in the number of burglars being willing to reoffend even when they were arrested for burglary within the same year. This stat shows, perhaps more than any other, a willingness to recidivate. Lastly, in 2020, arrestees were 27% more likely to be rearrested over a 6-month period following their previous burglary arrests. This is a statistically significant increase after accounting for all control variables. So we feel that this slide shows that based on all of these stats, this confirms the opinion of the law enforcement professionals whom we interviewed in that the reforms have led to a reduction in pretrial detention, as well as burglars being released more often, facing less post-arrest consequences, and therefore recidivating more often. As I stated earlier, the data did not statistically prove that shootings increased due to the reforms, but the data did suggest that there is some link. because there were increases in some categories that are directly related to gun violence, as we'll see on this slide here. Gun arrests were up 29% when compared to 2019, which indicates far more people were carrying firearms illegally. And we know from experience that those who commit a crime with a firearm often do so with an illegal gun, as opposed to one legally possessed. Those rearrested on gun possession increased by 14%, and gun arrestees who pled guilty at arraignment decreased by 86%. Some of these statistics were similar to burglary. The above statistics show that gun possession suspects are now far less likely to plead guilty, and they reoffend at an increased rate when compared to 2019 before the justice reforms. These stats indicated that far more people carry guns illegally immediately following the reforms, which likely contributed to the 102% increase in shooting victims that New York City experienced. We think further research would be beneficial once more time has elapsed from the reforms to see if gun violence continues and to see if there is a tie to the reform, which brings us to the limitations of the study, of course. It was difficult to accurately account for a year which had both COVID-19 pandemic and the wide-scale protests we saw following the death of George Floyd, as occurrences on this scale have never occurred in the same year before in all the years that criminal justice statistics have been maintained. We only had a 6-month period of recidivism to look at because there isn't yet a full year following 2020, the first full year of the reforms. And obviously, we only had one calendar year to look at, which is 2020, following the reforms. So future researchers will have far more data to look at in terms of arrests and recidivism. Which brings us to our policy recommendations. We recommend that the governor of the state of New York appoint a committee to discuss practical criminal justice reforms and recommend changes to the New York State legislature. This type of committee was not assembled prior to the reforms that took place on January 1st of 2020. This committee should consist of leaders among local law enforcement, specifically the New York City Police Commissioner and the Superintendent of the New York State Police. It should also include district attorneys from 5 boroughs and upstate counties, as well as union leaders representing police, correction, and court officers. Selected members of the committee should give expert testimony before the state legislature to provide lawmakers with insight as to the practical implications of any proposed changes of the law. And they can testify to the specific impacts that impact their areas, such as policing or prosecution. We further recommend that the legislature reconsider allowing judges in New York State to consider the risk to the public when deciding on pretrial detention or setting cash bail. This public safety provision is part of the law in every other state, and writing it into the law in New York would provide greater clarity and transparency in judicial decisions. Judges should be required to make it clear as to exactly what caused them to remand a particular suspect. We recommend that the legislature consider new reforms that require the courts in New York to use a risk assessment system similar to that system which is used in New Jersey. Trained risk assessors will review the histories of each arrestee and then provide a recommendation to the judge. And we feel that they should do that based on 3 categories: the risk posed to the public if the person's released, the likelihood of the offender reoffending, and then a measure that addresses recidivism, which is the likelihood of the offender committing the same offense while awaiting trial if released. Finally, we recommend returning discretion to police supervisors with regard to the granting of desk appearance tickets, so that the supervisor may deny the issuance of a ticket in limited circumstances when the supervisor believes there's either a threat to the public or, again, a clear pattern of recidivism with this particular arrestee. Our final word is that we believe the above recommendations will enhance the ability of law enforcement professionals to carry out the mission of keeping the public safe while staying consistent with the goal of ensuring fairness in the criminal justice system. And we believe that these goals are not mutually exclusive. That concludes our presentation. At this time, we would just like to thank all of the professors who have worked with us in this cohort. We appreciate your assistance and guidance. And of course, we have to thank Professor Jennifer Wynn for her tremendous contribution to this study. And we'd like to take questions at this time.
Peter, if I may, did you guys find any increase in the number of bench warrants issued because people who were released without bail just didn't come back?
That specific of a question, I can't recall. Zahid, do you recall that bench warrant aspect?
No, we specifically didn't look at that because honestly, how could we control for it, right? In 2020, the issuance of warrants would have been different, specifically because courts were closed. I mean, we know that COVID hit, courts closed right in the middle of our study period, which is that 6-month period. You figure March is right in the middle of it. We could have gotten that number, but no matter how you slice it, it definitely would have been skewed And, using it as a benchmark for increased recidivism, it just wouldn't have been valid for us. We wanted to see how the person that got arrested behaved differently. That was either through a decision made at arraignment or a decision made, in committing another crime.
Thanks.
It certainly is a valid question, though, too. In future research that has a bigger time period to review, should certainly take a look at that and the effect of decreased bail and what it has on returning to court.
I have a question sort of following up on that. First, let me say that I thought that was a really great job. And I tend to get crankier and more critical as the day goes on. So I'm pleased to see it end.
No, not you, Professor. No.
Especially to you, Chris. Watch it. I'm not done yet. But it was a really clear, well-presented presentation, especially the data part, Zahid, which it was well done. It was also, I found it, it's not definitive, but I found it quite convincing in what you're saying. My one, but wait a second, question is, it seems the huge variable is our courts closing. What do you have to say about that? Again,
this is, I think, one of the real limitations of the study and the problems with only having 2020 to look at. I think in a perfect world, we would have waited for the social justice protests and COVID to pass and maybe look at all of 2021 and compare that to the year before the reforms, 2019. And I think that would be an advantage that future researchers have. But we only had the 1 year, so we did the best we could with.
Well, you might be making things easy for a future group to replicate your research.
Can I just
another thing that I thought?
I wonder though, Peter, if the fact that the DPs were so down. Do you know what I mean? Like that's a decision that I think is made irrespective of the courts being open or closed, right? When the prosecutor's office just declines to prosecute.
Well, I mean, that's my question. If the courts are closed, they may just say we're going to decline to prosecute. I don't know.
Two things on that.
Well, no, because they still have their. Go ahead, Zahid.
Two things on that. So we look specifically at post-arrest behavior of arrestees. And when we look at arraignment activities, it's a very good point that you guys point out here. The DPs are not necessarily an arrestee choice. They're, of course, a DA choice. We do know the discovery laws hit January 1st. This was very much a sea change for how we process arrests here in the police department in New York City altogether. For everything that we presented today, whether it was an activity that the perpetrator, the defendant had control over, an arraignment decision or a rearrest versus the actions that the DA took on their own, which is to say DPing the case, we did have a 6-month study period, right, in 2020. And only 50% of that, mid-March onward, where the courts closed, we didn't see a huge difference in the rate of any of these markers across that 6-month period. So what I'm saying is, when you look at the number of DPs over the course of that 6-month period, they're pretty evenly distributed over the course of that 6 months. When you look at pled guilty over the course of that 6 months, when you look at rearrests over the course of that 6 months, when you look at arrests altogether over the course of that 6 months, nothing really changed. In fact, the only thing that changed from a rate standpoint in any meaningful way was the number of DATs granted for burglary, because for the first few months, burglary was DATable, and I believe we had 159 of them. And, from that day onward, of course, it was 0. So, I'm not dismissing the fact that court closures played a role. Our data, at least the stuff we looked at, didn't show a significant difference there.
Well, that's a good answer to that question. I also thought, which might make it more convincing, it would be nice to just see if another city without bail reform happened to have similar rises in recidivism. I would assume not, but to try and tease that out might be another way to add to that line. Evan, you have a question? Unmute yourself out. There you
go. What is a DA walkthrough?
A DA walkthrough is
ROR and declined to prosecute.
A DA walkthrough is an arraignment activity. What does it mean? I would argue you guys could largely ignore it. It's just a difference in the processing, the way that DA squad, so the NYPD has detectives that are embedded at each DA. And what they do is they'll help the DA prosecute high profile cases, mostly guns and higher order charges like that. In 2020, those units across the city embedded at those DA's offices, I'll just go back to that slide there.
I'm sorry, stop sharing, but you can start sharing again.
Well, I mean, the idea is, of course, it's a huge number, and I understand why you're asking it.
Evan, did you also ask about ROR and decline to prosecute? Evan, you're muted again.
Just to clear this out, the way those units process their arrests changed. They no longer would give the paperwork and rely on somebody else to bring down the prisoner. The DA squad would personally go down and walk through, quite literally, the prisoner through the entire process. The only reason we have it on the slide, frankly, is we wanted to show all arraignment activities with a difference above a certain threshold. In other words, you're seeing all the big changes. While it's not really relevant to this conversation, we wanted it to be on there because we don't want to just exclude it and it's out in the ether.
By the way, if I can comment on the decline, I know he also mentioned the decline to prosecutes. I think that 67% increase is really a stark increase because that's something that's looked at, beyond just not only the prosecutors look at that. Here in the borough, we look at that as well. And if there's a precinct with a real increase in decline to prosecute, we'll ask the precinct, is there a certain officer that's contributing to this? What is causing it? And if we see it's not that, then we will, when we meet with the district attorney, Melinda Katz, we will mention something like that. So it is a stark increase to see a number go up that much in one calendar year.
Thank you, guys. Excellent presentation also.
I'll keep asking questions, but I'm waiting for other people as well. You have all this wonderful data, which is wonderful data. And you're going to say, okay, recidivism, time between recidivism, went down from 62.2 to 54.3 days, 2019 versus 2020. How, and someone's going to just say Khalif Browder. How do you, the bail reform debate is so sort of driven by, people are talking past each other on this. How can you bring together personal feelings, which matter, with hard data, which matter, with policy that matter? How do we work? Where do we go from here?
I think one of our policy recommendations is something. It's kind of funny when we mentioned it last week. Professor McCormick's, comment to us was that it's a little bit obvious having a committee that would testify before the New York State Legislature, involving some real prominent players like the police commissioner and the superintendent of the state police. It's kind of surprising that that was not done before bail reform. No one heard from the district attorneys in New York counties who might have been able to say, hey, we actually agree with bail reform. We think the case of Khalif Browder is terrible and there needs to be some real changes, but let's hold on and look at exactly what we're doing and make some changes that make some real sense and maybe pull back on some things that might add to recidivism.
I think the overall objective too was to reduce pretrial incarceration and even the playing field. And just because you're poor or minority, you shouldn't be held in prison as your court case plays out. Instead of looking at other places and getting stakeholders involved, law enforcement, district attorneys, defense attorneys, and have an honest conversation, the legislature kind of push these things through, and not even as part of its independent reform. It was part of the state budget. Had they looked just across the river to New Jersey, in 2017, New Jersey did this, also with the intent of reducing the prison population, the jail population, pre-trial detention. They were successful in doing that, but they were also successful in keeping crime down. They had a pre-trial assessment that also gave the judge ability to set bail in appropriate cases when the offender reoffended or was a habitual offender. All those mechanisms to ensure public safety were left out of the New York reform. And that was because there was no conversation with stakeholders that could have brought these things to the legislature's attention. And there's a track record, in an adjoining state that was much more effective initially than the New York State reforms have been.
Chris, I'll get to you in 1 second. Let me ask a question from Tim McCormick, but I'm going to ask specifically directed to Chris, because I've known you, Chris, for 2 years now. And my question is about bias. Like all inside researchers, I know you had to overcome bias in this project. I know your feelings on this from CRJ 711. So can you talk about specific steps you took to overcome your bias in the course of your research?
Well, I mean, as we pointed out, or as actually we discussed in the class early on, that just because there's a crime increase and it follows a certain change doesn't mean that the crime increase was caused from that change. So when we started looking at this data, we know what we thought, but we really didn't know what this data was going to show. We didn't know we were going to have this increase in decline to prosecute, this decrease in burglars pleading guilty at arraignment, these stark percentages that we have up there on figure 1. That's our favorite slide because it really lays out some of these changes. So you're right. There was we had to overcome a bias with it. So we decided we were going to let the research take us where it took us. And as you heard in the presentation, the data did not show us that, shootings increased due to criminal justice reform. We presented that, which is not to say that criminal justice reform did not contribute to the increase in shootings, but the data didn't show it at this time. And when there's a longer time to look at, perhaps it will, perhaps it won't, but we'll have a much greater pool of recidivists to look at that time. And we'll see, well, did people who were arrested for a shooting and were out on bail, did they continue to recidivate? There just wasn't a large enough pool with a large enough amount of time to look at that. But you're right, overcoming the bias was an important factor.
Jenna, I wanted to ask you, I think Jen, we've known each other for over a decade. You know what I'm going to ask to you.
Listen, they asked for me to be their advisor, and that's how they helped. That's how they forced themselves to overcome their bias, because I was a big proponent of bail reform.
That's true. I can't believe I didn't mention that.
Right. So I gave them such a hard time. I'm like, you need to show me the data, right? That this is not working. So, I think, so that was a built-in control.
So what's your take on this, Professor Nguyen?
My take on this is they've convinced me. They have convinced me. And if you were to ask me which one of the 3 aspects of the criminal justice reform package that I think is probably the strongest contributor to this, and I think it's the taking away the discretion from the precinct commanders to detain people, who they think they know the community, and they can take a look at an offender who might not be exhibiting seriously violent behavior, but happen to know that person is they just knowing their background. So to put police supervisors in the position where they have to mandatorily release somebody who they just arrested, I think is such a recipe for disaster. So they've convinced me.
Professor Herman, thank you for your patience.
I should have put that in the findings that we convinced Professor Jennifer Nguyen. That actually should have been right in there.
the most amazing finding of all. Chris Herman?
Never too late for a revision, right? So my question is about the district attorney's offices. They all act independently. I'm curious if you came across some differences between the DA's offices and how they handled all of these, reforms.
Are we talking specifically about discovery? I think that's the headline when we talk about DA's offices, or are we talking about everything here? Because that's also the one that they have control over.
Yeah, I was looking for the big picture. Did you get a sense that they all acted kind of, towards the same direction with regards to reforms, or did you feel like some of the DA's offices were irregular, I guess, when it came to incorporating some of these new reforms?
Well, I'll tell you with the piece of data that we have in here that speaks to DA actions, which of course is decline prosecutions, and I can combine that with some firsthand experience having dealt with the process of digitizing the police department's arrest processing flow. And what all the DAs were expecting, this is all the DAs, the 5 boroughs, Special Narcotics, and Corp Counsel. When it came to discovery obligations, it became very clear in late 2019 at all these meetings with the respective borough offices that they couldn't have this fractured system where Manhattan wanted this and Queens wanted that. they had to come together and agree on what the ask was going to be from the police department, and they did. And to this day, we as a department, in particular CJB, we only respond to, if it's a new request for, let's say, something that's going to satisfy discovery, it has to be signed off on by all of the offices. And it's something that I think the offices themselves have vested interest in, right? I mean, it doesn't really make much sense to do something somewhere and not in a different borough. And then had that brought up in court, why is it being done somewhere else in New York City? So we have seen them, with basically no exception, move in lockstep when it comes to discovery. And so when it comes to their actions in response to discovery, DPs in this case, while I don't have the numbers broken out by borough, I would imagine they're very consistent.
I've listened to these presentations, and I have to always harken back to the first cohort and the conversations we had around why we created this opportunity in the first instance. And with each class, I think we've seen, with each cohort, we've seen the incredible commitment and the fact that people who didn't have that opportunity because life got in the way to take advantage of getting their graduate degrees have walked away or run away with any notion that somehow they wouldn't be ready or prepared to put in the work and do what was necessary. And I can tell you, just from listening to the presentations, I agree with all of you that the work is just stellar. And for me, as someone who will be following up with these individuals, and actually, this work wasn't in vain, because it's been incredibly informative, and the research that you've done and the issues you've raised and the recommendations, I think, have lots of promise in a variety of ways for the agency, and that's exactly the reason we wanted to make sure that we tap this fountain of talent that's out there with all of you. So from me to you, bravo, incredible work. And thank you to the faculty, because you all, I think, had some reservations. Some of you did anyway, Peter. Just reflecting on a conversation you and I had about the efficacy of where we would go. I know Jeremy and I believed in it 110% from the very beginning. And I'm sure that you would agree that we ended where we are today is a testament to that. So thanks, everyone. Well done.
Let me take a moment to thank you first, Deputy Commissioner Tucker, because you know this and I know this, but I just want to make it clear that your support, before I was involved in this program, your support allowed this program to exist, and your continued support has really helped us through all of this. And your dedication, the lines of communication you've kept open with me, and your attendance at our graduations and at our presentations is it shows a commitment and a dedication that is greatly appreciated. So thank you.
No, absolutely.